A Body of Doctrinal Divinity, Book 1, Chapter 19, of The Joy of God, by Dr. John Gill, narrated by David Clark. Joy, which is often attributed to God in the Scriptures, bears some resemblance to the affection of joy in men, but is, by some philosophers, denied of him, and indeed is not to be considered as a passion in him as in them, and particularly when its height or at its excesses, as it is a transport of the mind and carries it out and beyond itself, as it were, as in the case of Jacob, when the news of his son Joseph's being alive was brought to him, and of the disciples when they heard of the resurrection of Christ, believed not for joy. And indeed all affections that are ascribed to God are ascribed to him not as in themselves, but as to their effects, such and such effects being done by men, when so and so affected. Hence, when similar ones are done by God, the like affections are ascribed to him, and this is of joy, is expressed by him in very different effects, as in inflicting punishment, as well as in conferring benefits. In the one he rejoices in the glory of his own justice and holiness, and in the other in the displays of his grace and goodness. Deuteronomy 28:63. Though joy, as ascribed to God, seems to be no other than delight and complacency in persons and things, so some philosophers and schoolmen make them to be the same, or however take joy to be as species of delight only. They observe a difference with respect to brute animals, in which there is delight but not joy. It is altogether a question with them whether delight is a passion, but my business with it is only as it concerns God and is predicated of him, and who may be said, 1. To rejoice and take delight and complacency in himself, in his own nature and the perfections of it, which there is an all-sufficiency, and so a fullness of content and satisfaction, and he rests infinitely well pleased in himself. Hence Aquinas, who defines joy and delight a certain quitation or rest of the will in what is willed by it, observes that God must greatly rest quiet and satisfied in himself, which is his spiritual volitum, or what is willed by him, as having all sufficiency in him, and therefore by his own will greatly rejoices and delights in himself. And though he makes joy and delight in some respects to differ, delight flowing from a good really conjoined, and joy being not only of that, but of something exterior. Hence, he says, it is plain God properly delights in himself, but rejoices in himself and others. So the Jews interpret 1 Chronicles 16:27, gladness in his place of joy in himself. 2. He rejoices and takes delight and complacency in his works. Psalm 104:31, in the works of creation, which, when he had finished, he not only rested from them, but rested in them with delight and pleasure. He looked over them and pronounced them all very good, and he still appears to have pleasure in them, by his countenance of them in being, by upholding all things by the word of his power. He rejoices and delights in the works of his providence, in which he is always concerned. John 5:17. These, so far as they are known by men, yield an unspeakable delight and pleasure in the contemplation of them, and especially when they will be manifest. And though they are now, many of them, unsearchable and past finding out, yet there is a depth of riches both of wisdom and the knowledge of God in them. But what delight must God take in them, being all according to his sovereign will and pleasure, by whom they are seen and known in their beauty, harmony and connection, and the springs and causes of them, and the several ends answered by them. God rejoices and takes delight particularly in the great work of redemption, contrived by his infinite wisdom and wrought out by his Son, partly because of his own glory displayed therein, as of his love, grace, mercy, so of his truth and faithfulness, holiness and justice, and partly because of the salvation of his people secured thereby. A thing his heart was set upon from everlasting, what he resolved should be done, and what he appointed them to. He rejoices and delights in his works of grace in the hearts of his people. This is their beauty, even the beauty of holiness, which he, the King, greatly desires, by which they are all glorious within, and well-pleasing in his sight. He delights in the graces which he himself, by his Spirit, has wrought in them, and in the exercise of those graces as drawn forth by him. Their faith, hope, love, fear, and the Lord taketh pleasure in them that fear him, in those that hope in his mercy. Psalm 147, 11, Songs 4, 9, 10. And so all his people, as they are his workmanship, his poem curiously wrought by him, and the works of his hands, in whom and whereby he is glorious. He rejoices in them, and blesses on account of them. Isaiah 19, 25, 60, 21. Wherefore, 3. He may truly said to rejoice, delight, and take pleasure in his people, as he often is. They are his Hephzibah, in whom he delights, his Beulah, to whom he is married, and therefore, as a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so does the Lord rejoice over them. Psalm 149, 4, Isaiah 62, 4, 5. Not in all men, for there are some in whom he has no joy, vessels to whom he has no delight and pleasure. Isaiah 9, 17, 27, 11, Micah 1, 10. But his special covenant people, Jeremiah 32, 38 to 41, and these not as creatures, and still less as sinful creatures, either as considered in Adam or in themselves guilty and defiled, but as in Christ, in whom God is well pleased, and in all that are in him, as chosen in him, and given to him. So God the Father rejoiced in them from everlasting, so as his love to them. So his joy in them is so early, it being a love of complacency and delight, and of which joy there is new expressions of. In conversion, see Luke 15, 7, 9, 22, 24. And likewise, the Son of God was from all eternity rejoicing in the habitable parts of the earth, and his delights were with the sons of men. Proverbs 8:31. And which joy he felt under his sorrows and sufferings, when working out their salvation. Hebrews 12:2. And which he expresses at their conversion, that being the time of finding his lost people, and indeed the day of his open espousals to them, and so of the gladness of his heart. Luke 15, 3-5, Songs 3:11. And they will also be his joy and crown of rejoicing in the last day, when they shall be introduced into his presence, not only with joy and gladness in themselves, but with it in him, who will present them before his Father and himself with exceeding joy. Psalm 45:13, 14, Jude 1:24. And this joy over them, both in him and his divine Father, is to do them good, and issues in it to bestow benefits upon them, grace here and glory hereafter, to beautify them with salvation, to make them prosperous, especially in spiritual things, in which prosperity he takes pleasure, and in making all things work together for their good. Jeremiah 32:41, Psalm 149, 3, 35:27. Which joy is full, there is a redundancy, an overflow of it. It is hearty and sincere, is the strength and sincerity of the saints, and will remain forever. Nehemiah 8:10, Zephaniah 3:17.